TABConf 2022. Awesome to be here. Thanks, everybody. I'm really excited to be joined by two awesome people from Lightning Labs here to talk about stablecoins on Lightning. So I think it's going to be a really good conversation. So I have a list of questions, obviously, and then I think we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end as well. So to kick things off, we really can't even start talking about stablecoins on Lightning until we talk kind of about Taro a little bit. I know you guys had a workshop yesterday that went through a lot of kind of maybe how it works and a little bit of like ways to use it, but maybe for anyone that didn't catch that, can you give a brief rundown of what Taro is and how it works?
Cool. Yeah, so it's basically kind of like a way to represent like arbitrary assets on Bitcoin, right? And you can say, okay, well, like, what is an asset, right? So you kind of like have certain particular things, like kind of like a very like particular kind of like, format that specifies like the name of the asset, the amount of what type of asset it is as well too. A bunch of things around there, because like, probably the biggest thing it does, you can say is like, okay, well, Bitcoin doesn't have like a sort of global namespace for like names, right? So we need kind of like a unique asset ID, right? And how do we get that? Well, we can say, okay, well, outpoints are unique, basically like kind of like a TXID structure is never going to repeat on the chain itself. So we can then use that to actually create unique asset IDs, right? And as far as like how things work underneath, there's kind of like basically like a tree of trees. We kind of like have the taproot tree, which has all the scripts basically. Then we add another like tree root into that basically commits to all the assets, and then each asset basically then has like another commitment below that. And the main thing here is that like we talked about it I think during the workshop. There's something called like a Merkle sum tree, which basically lets you say rather than just like have a Merkle tree that has a root committed to particular things, you also then actually commit to the sum of the siblings basically all the way up. So this is really cool because all of a sudden now I can say, okay, well, this is my root. I have 20 beef bucks, right? And you can now maybe randomly sample me and basically say, okay, well, do you actually have all those different beef bucks? You can add them all up and basically have that thing there. And that's kind of like the base part of Taro itself. And that kind of like is how you hold it. And one important thing is that like Taro assets basically live in a taproot output itself, right? So you can kind of like have like a one-to-one correspondence if you wanted to, or you can say, okay, well, I want to have like 1,000 assets in one output, or I want to make like 1,000 outputs or 10,000 assets, single transaction. It supports kind of like batching both on the taproot and also the Taro level as well. It has a bunch of other really cool things around the proof format, things like that. That's kind of like a not too high level, but a mid-level explanation perhaps of how things work under the hood. I don't know if Ryan wants to add on that.
In the dumb person's business speak, at a really high level, the way I like to talk about Taro is Taro lets us, create these additional assets, which I think of as, UTXOs within the UTXO. So in a pre-Taro world, you think of all your Bitcoin outputs, your UTXOs, they're empty, right? It's just Bitcoin. If you go and mint a bunch of new Taro assets, what you're doing is you're spending your UTXO, creating a new output, and you're filling it up with these new assets, with these Taro assets. And the really cool thing about the way it's been designed is that then those assets, because they're just UTXO within UTXO, they natively will interoperate with the Lightning Network, right? We can make HTLCs with them, we can transfer them across the Lightning Network, and that just lends itself, to the purpose of why we're talking about this, is for assets that can be sent across the Lightning Network, and we just know from tons of, customer research, market research, looking at just general growth of stablecoins broadly across the ecosystem, that there's going to be tons and tons of demand for using stablecoins on Lightning, because it gives you, this best of both worlds approach. You get, the low fees, the instant settlement, the global reach of the Lightning Network, and you get, the stability of whatever your preferred unit of count is. And so we just see that as like a really cool opportunity that's uniquely enabled by, the protocol that Olaoluwa designed, the team designed, that we presented on yesterday at the workshop.
And I think one important thing to mention as well is like, in order to use Taro, you actually need Bitcoin, right? Because like it's Bitcoin transaction with additional metadata actually in the output itself, right? For example, we were doing the workshop yesterday, people were like, oh, it's saying like I can't fund the PSBT. Well, you don't have any Bitcoin in your wallet, basically, right? So I think that's like a very important thing that, okay, well, if this actually gets popular, this is actually going to drive more demand for Bitcoin itself. Maybe we'll actually have transaction fees, which is like an important thing and for the future of the network. And in the future, maybe people are like low fees right now. But it's kind of a thing where it's like, very like, tightly coupled together, basically, where Taro can't exist without Bitcoin. And if it gets popular and people are using it for other things, that's good for Bitcoin as well, because we then also like able to like maintain that network effect basically and get that mind share and make sure people are actually working on what we want to be the blockchain basically that everything else hooks into, right? So
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great overview, and I'm really interested in beef bucks when they come out, so please keep us posted on that. Okay, so then that's a good segue, and Ryan was getting a little ahead of himself there. But so when we talk about like stablecoins or just issuing assets, I think in general on top of Bitcoin, why is Taro a good way to issue assets compared to the other alternatives that are out there? Maybe say ERC20 tokens or something.
Good question. So I think one thing, at least from the Bitcoin developer perspective, so I think like one goal of like kind of creating it was like it should be basically friendly to Bitcoin developers, right? It shouldn't look like any other random other system. You don't want to learn a new VM, a new language, all this other stuff. It should basically look and feel like Bitcoin itself, right? If you ever look at kind of like the way things work, okay, you have like a Bitcoin input and an output basically, but then inside a leaf, this is like kind of like where your asset lives in this commitment thing. You also have inputs and outputs as well too, right? So let's say I wanted to swap beef bucks for BTC, right? That's just a multi-input, multi-output transaction basically. Something if you're familiar with PSBTs or you have like a library that can already do this Bitcoin stuff is already looking like looks very natural to you. Like I would say one advantage I think is that like for example if you look at the way stuff like ERC trading works, there's like basically like a giant key value map at the contract layer in the consensus system itself, right? So every single person has an entry in this map. So let's say there's like 20 million holders of this particular asset or whatever else. That means there's 20 million key value pairs in this thing itself that needs to be updated. Even like deploying the contract can be very expensive because it has all this additional data and all the states actually on the system itself. But with something like Taro, for example, I can have one transaction that creates a million assets basically, and that's just a million different leaves in that particular thing, right? And I can also selectively reveal to you, okay, I have this, I have this, I have this thing as well, kind of like being able to preserve the privacy system a little more effectively, right? So I'd say why? Well, you can basically retain the network effects of Bitcoin, the most secure blockchain in the world. You also are able to kind of like have like a very like natural application interface for Bitcoin developers. I think that's one thing that like I tried to improve on with Taro is that like I think people tried some things in the past, but like they weren't very Bitcoin friendly basically. They just look like an entirely different system, which is like a big barrier because now I need all these different tool chains. But everyone here, if they're a developer, they probably know how to parse Bitcoin transaction, right? Or have a library that lets them do that basically. And this is able to basically inherit all of that additional tooling, and also like because it's based on Taproot, anything that you have that's doing like Schnorr signatures, Musig, Frost, all that also works in Tower layer as well. So we're trying to basically make sure we're retaining all these network effects basically because these are things that take a very very long time to build up, but they're also very very powerful in terms of like the reach and also kind of like the amount of activity and the amount of funding, the amount of excitement that goes along with that. So I think there's a few things that I think are more compelling in this or in much other. So
yeah, and like really want to echo and re-emphasize the focus on network effects and on leveraging already bootstrapped systems and already bootstrapped liquidity instead of starting over from scratch, right? Like the Lightning Network is growing in a really nice rapid clip right now, but that was a number of years and a lot of hard work to get that flywheel to start going, and so why Taro over maybe other implementations or other kind of strategies for deploying stablecoins of Bitcoin is that it's purpose built, from not only the design, the UTXO within UTXO structure that I talked about, like even the fact that it uses the TLV format, right? That HTLCs can be made. It's natively designed to interoperate with the Lightning Network, and there's all of these like kind of subtle things that mean that we don't have to start from scratch. We can just plug this into an already rapidly growing system and kind of piggyback on the network effects of the Lightning Network already, rather than starting over from scratch, which would just be a tough road and a long slog. And we know that already there are users on the Lightning Network that want this stuff. So why not build a protocol purpose built to give the people what they want?
Yeah, definitely. And like I think one of the things, there's kind of like a few things in Taro that may not be immediately kind of like obvious, but I think are super important. They say like real G's move in silence because what I mean by that. For example, like I was talking about covenants in the prior panel basically, which is basically the ability to kind of like introspect into the transaction state and like do things like, okay, well, this output must have an even value, or maybe you can only have like 3 outputs, right? So if you look at the way things work, like you can say like there's like a top level Taproot output, right? And the actual asset tree itself, you get like a tweak or a root basically, which then creates that output value, right? So imagine if we had covenants that were able to say, okay, well, I will actually reconstruct the tree in script itself. Once again, you're not explicitly adding Taro into Bitcoin itself, but you're adding kind of covenant introspection capabilities. I could then enforce certain rules as well, right? So I can enforce things like a swap. I can say, okay, well, I sent 5 and you got 3, so therefore this should be the root over here, right? And I think that's a really cool thing. And also you can say as well, someone could even pass in certain auxiliary information, which maybe isn't necessarily computed within Bitcoin script itself, but as long as you're able to, kind of compute exactly what that new key should be, then that's a really cool thing. So for example, like, AJ had this thing called like tap, leap, update, verify, and you can say if you have something that lets you recompute kind of like that tap tweak, giving a public key and a kind of like a root tweak basically, you can then feasibly enforce some of these rules on chain eventually in the future. So it's kind of a thing where it's okay, well, if it gets big, there are ways we can like make it more powerful, kind of like within the software paradigm, but we don't necessarily need to do that. But that's kind of all additive. But there's a bunch of other different kind of like layers as far as like why things were designed the way they were. So.
Okay, awesome. That's a really good overview of like Taro and like asset issuance on Bitcoin. So then getting into more of the intent of this conversation is around stable coins. And so can you guys maybe describe a little bit just generally what a stable coin is, and then why is it important to have stable coins on Lightning in general?
Yeah, so I think I've said this a lot, but it bears repeating because it's very true. Last year, sparked by the El Salvador Bitcoin legal tender at Bitcoin 2021. Last year was just this massive wave of emerging markets adoption for Lightning, right? Everywhere from El Salvador to Brazil to Nigeria to South Africa to Vietnam, like all around the world. We heard from all of these Lightning entrepreneurs that were getting lots and lots of new users spurred by kind of this big news, like, oh man, like the nation state is adopting Bitcoin. As the year progressed and kind of we got towards the end of the year and into the start of this year, and communicating with those entrepreneurs on the ground, we kept hearing, like, okay, like this has been great, the best year we've had so far. I got all the Bitcoiners, right? All the Bitcoiners in my area are using my app, and kind of like this next concentric circle of users that I'm going to try and acquire, like the Bitcoin, the asset, is a bridge too far. They just want the dollar. Right, they want the dollar experience, like they want the benefits of the Lightning Network. They want the global reach, the instant settlement. They want the really low fees, but just like the mental hurdle to adopting Bitcoin is a bit too much. And if we could give them stable coins like they have on Tron or Ethereum or whatever, right, like they would be able to go and acquire those next tier user. And especially like some of these businesses, for instance, merchant processors that aren't Bitcoin only and that are accepting, they see tons and tons of stablecoin volume coming in, and trust me, none of them want to be relying on Justin Sun's validator set for their funds, right? If you're seeing tons of USDT on Tron volume coming in, you don't want to be running a Tron node. You would much prefer that to be coming on your, running over your Lightning infrastructure, your Bitcoin infrastructure, which is actually, decentralized, trustless, and properly designed. So I think we've just seen tons of demand from, specifically emerging markets for stablecoins on Lightning, and tons of demand from existing Bitcoin companies that want to be moving stablecoin volume over to their Bitcoin infrastructure. And so that's why this is kind of like a really important thing to be working on right now.
Definitely. And like I think one of the relevant kind of like a mental model is, okay, there's kind of like, Bitcoin, the network, and then Bitcoin, the asset itself, right? And they aren't necessarily in lockstep. And some people only like the money, and some people like the network itself. And you can say, okay, well, if they were always in lockstep, every time there was like a new fundamental development, milestone, the price would go up or something like that. But that just doesn't happen, right? And sometimes things are completely out of whack where the price 50x and nothing has changed, right? But so I think one kind of like important mental model there, particularly with kind of like the network effect once again, is that like, so this is, you can say like my journey as far as like changing my mental model, my mind on why this maybe is like a worthy thing to actually work on, right? So back in the day, when I first started out in Bitcoin, this is like a while ago, basically like Bitcoin is always like the main crossing trading pair, basically, right? Every single alt was dominated Bitcoin. Stablecoins didn't really exist, right? So anytime someone was up on Namecoin or Feathercoin, all this random stuff back then, basically they always wanted to come back to BTC itself, right? And if you look at the trading volumes, the BTC pair was always the highest volume pair typically, because people were coming in and out. Because why? Because they can move in and out very, very easily. It's all chain to chain to chain type of thing, right? Then stablecoins started to come across, right? And one thing I saw kind of changing is like, okay, well now this is now the dominant pair basically, right? And this pair is actually primarily on other chains as well, right? So that means we're kind of like losing network effect now, losing volume. One of my pet hypotheses as well is like this has also led to basically the reduction in the mempool fees basically as well. Because in the past you would see things happen, the mempool get super clogged, people were doing ARB, they're moving all around, things like that. But now they're just moving on all these other things basically that have the 0.5 second block time and it's super insecure, blah blah blah. But they want to move this stuff around, right? So I think that's part of why I felt like, okay, this is maybe a weird thing to basically bring that network effect back to Bitcoin basically, right? Have Bitcoin be the blockchain, everything else is crossing between it basically, and you're hooking whatever else is there, but it's still Bitcoin proper, right? And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, for the way Taro works, you basically need Bitcoin to use Taro in the first place, right? Because once again, brings back that network effect basically, and brings back that demand, that flywheel onto the systems as well. So that was like my, my mental process changing over time. First I was like, oh, these things aren't going to last. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, they're still around. Okay, they're getting kind of big. Okay, like, things are moving elsewhere. Then it's like, okay, well, I need to like reconcile my worldview with basically what's going on in the world itself, basically. I need to change my mind and see like how we can actually make sure that we're able to make sure, Bitcoin's like, number one, and actually being able to take advantage of all of this new activity and all this like, investment and everything else going on in the ecosystem. So that's kind of like how I change my process, my mental thought, train of thought as a developer, so.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to ignore an asset that's like on the tens of billions, right, in size. It's pretty hard to ignore an asset that's like hundreds of billions, right? And there's $100 billion worth of stable coins out there, and I totally agree that like that should be brought over to Bitcoin the network.
Yeah, I mean I think that's a really interesting and important point of like the difference between Bitcoin, the network, and Bitcoin, the asset, and then all of the things that you mentioned as well of kind of the usage so far, and that was not something to be ignored. So that's really interesting. So maybe talk a little bit about what you guys have seen is in like the developer ecosystem around stablecoins and Taro, and like kind of maybe where that's at, and like the status of like like how close are we, and all of those things.
Sure. Yeah. So we had the workshop. Anyone that was there, and hopefully you got things running. Shout out to Jamal for making Polar. Made it really easy to get people running up and running as well. And I think some people made some assets, they sent them around, things like that. So a few weeks ago we released kind of like the alpha, which is basically okay. That was enough that we can ship it out there, and we won't feel too bad about like things not really working, right? So today what you can do, you can basically make assets. You can send it back and forth. There's some kind of like some limits that like I think one of our people has like a PR that's going to fix. Mostly, today you can't like send a full value, so you basically always need to have like a change output. Similar to kind of like Bitcoin, you can't have 10 and send 10. That's like something we're fixing. And also like you can't send collectibles either, and that's like a special case of that itself, right? But so today you can basically spin it up. It's on SimNet, it's on testnet. Perfectly once again like in lightning last fashion, like we took out the mainnet option because like hey, it's super new. Like at your own risk you can recompile it, but like I think the next day we broke like a file format or something like that, right? So things you can say are still kind of like unstable on the API level. I think what we're looking for right now is basically people to start building on top of it and basically say hey like what are we missing on the API level, right? Because right now the APIs are made say okay well we can write tests with them. We can't necessarily build an application or a company or anything like that as well too. So I think the main thing is okay, people can take a look at it. Like we have the API docs that we have like on L&D. Say okay, exactly what's missing here. What cool thing would you have? I think another thing as well, like there's certain fields within the structure basically that are right now sort of like unspecified, right? There's for example there's like a metadata field. It's just like a blob, and the cool thing about the metadata field, like the metadata actually impacts the asset ID itself, right? So remember people were looking at things like ERC721, and they're like oh it's a link, and the link isn't even in the hash, and it's not even in part of the thing, and they're kind of like you can just change it. It doesn't really matter, right? It's just kind of crazy, right? But in this case, you can do something like, let's say I made a beef Zard card. I could actually like, embed the hash of the thing inside the asset ID. So now there's a very like strong link one-to-one. So I think we're looking for feedback on, for example, like, okay, like what should that look like in the future? Is this some JSON blob? Is there a TLV there? There's probably going to be standards around like the way people interpret different assets and like how they verify the fields and things like that as well. And probably one of the biggest things that we still need to get in the next version, we're doing another release, is kind of like this whole concept of like, bootstrapping an asset, right? Or kind of like, being able to verify the supply of an asset, right? So people look at today, there's something called like a Genesis bootstrap that you basically copy paste back and forth. You basically need to copy paste like 2 or 3 different things to basically make an address, right? So the way it would work ideally is like, okay, well, I go and say, hey, I want to start using beef bucks. But okay, well, what is a beef bucks? Well, so beef bucks is basically anything that's created from this particular output on chain. Well, how do I verify that? It's basically like a series of Merkle proofs for me to go into that and say, okay, well, this was created on the chain itself. It's like another tree. So now I can basically have effectively a sort of audit trail, right? So I basically know the amount of beef bucks actually in supply yet. So it's going to be a very important thing. We're looking for analogies. You can say it's kind of like similar to a cross between like MIT key server, like a Git server, and then also like a TLS sense, right? So you kind of like bootstrapping that first thing, and once you have that installed, basically, then you can say, okay, now I can make a new address. And I think another relevant thing there is like, for example, like there's no way to have like a global namespace, right? Global unique namespace, right? But for you, beefbucks is going to be defined by the asset ID, which is dependent on that out point as well too. So once you have that like bootstrapped onto your chain, or sorry, onto your node, then you can actually use it more effectively. Another analogy is similar to like whenever you S8 into a new server, it's like, hey, do you want to trust that key fingerprint? You typically click yes. So it's kind of like a tofu, type model, basically bootstrapping. So that's kind of like some additional things as far as we're going with development in the near term to basically get to the milestone on mainnet. Because if you can't audit the supply of something, then it's hard to actually use it properly and actually interact with it. I think another thing that will be done as well. It's basically kind of like a sort of like explorer, right? So today people like, they have mempo.space, they have Explorer, they have, blockchain info, things like that as well. They can basically use that to basically track, things on chain, and maybe they're like showing a demo. For example, that big transaction that, affected L&D the other day, like, people looked at an Explorer to basically look at that thing, right? Right now there's not really an Explorer, for the Tower system itself, right? And the reason for that is because, the data actually isn't directly on chain. Instead, someone basically needs to like, submit the data to, to some other party if they want to selectively reveal it basically, but then there can be a way to kind of like, explore that or like, navigate things as if they were, actually on chain itself, right? So we're going to be working on the API for that, but I think people will also start to build out their own stuff. So I'm really excited to see what people build as far as like asset verification, explorers, different type of games and things like that as well too. And so now our job is basically to make sure we can give you the APIs to like make all that stuff a reality, and for you to start experimenting, having fun, and making cool shit. So.
Yeah, I think all of those kind of specific examples were fantastic, and we're excited for all those people. But like zooming out, I think what we're both maybe most excited about with introducing Taro is kind of like reinvigorating the spirit of permissionless innovation in the Bitcoin developer ecosystem, right? Like here's this new greenfield space to play in where like, you can do kind of whatever you want, right? Like go nuts, build some Bizarre cards and do all kinds of crazy stuff. But, if you think about like the history of this year of the protocol in April at Bitcoin 20, right before Bitcoin 2022, where we made the big announcement, we dropped 6 bips, right? On that's a lot of stuff to slog through. And in conversations throughout the summer, it was just clear that like there was a lot of interest, there was a lot of demand, there was a lot of curiosity, but it was such a big new thing, and it was like abstract. It was hard for people to kind of wrap their minds around. Since we dropped the alpha a couple weeks ago, the Taro channel in the LND dev Slack has been popping, right? There's people checking it out, they're asking questions, they're getting expired. Like now it's been made concrete, where it's like you can actually touch the stuff and play with it and like kind of see what the possibilities are. So really excited with that, and then with our workshop yesterday, continuing to make it easier and easier to experiment with. We already got a shout out to Jamal and Puller, right? Continuing to make it to where you can go from, idea to testing it out on reg test in like 10 minutes or something like that. That's kind of where we want to get to and where we're getting, and we can start getting into that cycle of iteration where, people are going to want to build explorers, people are going to want to build, swapping services, right? Like one other thing I want to talk about is not just developers being excited, but like, one thing that Lightning has always been really good for, but was like not quite big enough was, for traders and for, more of like markets-based people, markets-focused people. Now that like they're seeing, oh man, so there's going to be like multiple assets on the Lightning Network, and so I can, do a circular rebalance and have that be a BTC to USD swap, right? Like all of a sudden that's kind of like, oh man, there's all sorts of financial applications that can be built on this thing, right? There's all sorts of like new trades and new financial products that we can start experimenting with that I think is going to be really, really exciting once we get up to the Lightning layer.
And like I think one thing I want to say like around like Slack you mentioned, I think the cool thing is like a lot of people that are on that Slack channel, like I don't know them. I've never seen them on LND chat. I've never seen them on the repo. Like they're just brand new people, and I'm like, oh, they kind of know shit. They've been researching stuff. So I think it's really cool to basically like get that like new developer base and get that new blood and basically get like new ideas and things like that as well. Once again, continue to grow the pie basically and get more people working on Bitcoin stuff, which is basically the goal of this stuff in the first place. So that was really cool to me. Just like, okay, these are new people. Like they're not like they weren't necessarily the OGs are there, like people on Slack, like random people like that. But there were a lot of new people as well, which is cool. So.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen a huge amount of activity in the Taro channel on your guys' Slack, and so that has been really interesting. And I do think that is a great thing that we've seen is, naturally because this is built on Bitcoin, even if you haven't had exposure to Bitcoin or Lightning yet, and you are interested in this, you have to learn about Bitcoin and Lightning in some way, and it's great for the education and getting people involved. So that's really good. So now that we've kind of gone through those things, I think that there's obviously some skepticism across people of like, doing these new things on top of Bitcoin, bringing more assets in, and so like maybe touch on a little bit how does bringing these assets into Bitcoin and the Lightning Network, how does it affect the Bitcoin and Lightning Network? Like me as a node runner, how does this affect me? Like what is am I going to be routing payments like normal? Am I going to be doing different things? Like how does it affect the greater network from how it operates today?
Really good question. I mean, so, I think the easy answer is like, if you don't want it to, it doesn't necessarily affect you, right? It's like an opt-in type of thing. For example, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, like, you need Bitcoin to use Taro, right? So the immediate effect, like, let's say it gets really, really big. Okay, well, maybe like, the miners get more fees, right? Maybe, fees are a little more tangible. Maybe people aren't as scared about like what happens in 150 years with the subsidy and things like that as well. So I think that's one thing there where it's okay, you'll see transactions. And I think the cool part is like, because they use Taproot, you won't necessarily know it's a Taro transaction. Unless they're revealing information, publicly for those reasons, it will basically just be another transaction. Okay, it's using Taproot, that's really cool. On the off-chain layer, the thing there as well is that like, because these only exist at the edges, it's not going to be part of like, you can say the greater Lightning Network or the backbone of the Lightning Network itself. If you're not actually at the edge or like, have one of these like, different channels, you don't really see any difference, right? Maybe like you actually route more and more, funds yourself, right? So, if like, assuming that like, this gets big, increases demand for Lightning Network itself, it increases demand for kind of like the capacity of Lightning itself, you'll as a routing operator, maybe you see your fees go up. Maybe like, oh, I'm routing double for some reason. Like, okay, I ain't mad at it. Like, keep it going, right? Like, like you're not gonna be mad that you're earning more money, right? And I think the other thing as well is like, because things are one-to-one, for example, because like, something at the Taro layer actually requires you to route over the Lightning Network itself. In order to like increase that, capacity of that layer, we also need more Bitcoin in the Lightning Network itself, right? So there's like a flywheel. So, okay, well, more demand for Taro, more transactions, more Bitcoin, more capacity, more transaction fees, more routing volume, and this is like, ideally kind of like spins on this like type of flywheel basically, and brings more and more people into the ecosystem and gets a lot bigger as well too, right? So if you don't necessarily want to mess with any of this stuff, that's cool. You don't have to. It's once again, Bitcoin's a voluntary system, but if you want to like tap into it, maybe you get additional benefits. But even if not, if you're routing an operator and things get bigger and you see more volume, then that's great for you, right? Maybe you want to tap in, maybe you don't, but that's fine. Maybe this should just cause you to optimize your own liquidity, routing, things like that more. So maybe this actually then also adds pressure on people developing better algorithms, better tools, and just kind of like putting more research development back in the Lightning Network itself. So.
Yep, and I think it's really important to reemphasize that Lalo and team protocol designers took great pains to make sure that there is no increased validation burden, increased verification burden on full node operators if you don't want to, right? It's purely opt-in. You can run your Bitcoin full node, from 2013 or whatever, right? Fully backwards compatible, and have no idea that Taro's going on and be totally unaffected, right? Because it is an overlay network, and so I think that's really important. And I do think, one way thing I've been saying is I do think that Taro is like, the most incentive compatible way to bring exogenous assets to the Bitcoin chain, right? Which I think is really important. And so, the new stuff is like, if you want to opt in, it's just purely new opportunities, right? We got a new multi-asset network all of a sudden, right? And so, if you want to build new stuff, you want to be an edge node and kind of process these, the last hop conversion from BTC to Taro USD or something like that. Like, go for it, right? That's a brand new opportunity. Somebody's going to need to step up to do that, and that's a new way to make money on the Lightning Network, which I think is really exciting. And then kind of one final thing is just, for context, if people weren't here yesterday, the Lightning Gossip Network does not yet support Taproot outputs, right? And so when we have these Taro channels, each Taro channel will be a Taproot output on chain, and so we will not be able until the Gossip Network is overhauled to gossip out and announce that this channel is available for routing. So because of that kind of quirk, the Taro channels will just be first and last hop at the edges of the network for the foreseeable future, which means that when you go to send a Taro transaction across the Lightning Network, either you can start off in Bitcoin and just go Bitcoin, 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 Bitcoin every hop until the very end when it's converted into the Taro asset that the receiver wants to receive. You can do Taro at both the sending and receiving end, but importantly Bitcoin in the middle, or you can just do Taro at the send and Bitcoin throughout the rest of the hops of the network. So I think that's kind of where Lalo was talking about. If you're in the middle and you're just Bitcoin only, like, you may be routing Taro transactions, but to you it just looks like Bitcoin HTLCs. You'll just see volume numbers go up and not necessarily be impacted. Like, the only impact really is just positive, right? More volume, more routing fees.
Yep. And like you were saying, like, it's like this right now, but like maybe it'll stay like that, because I think one of an advantageous thing there is that, okay, well, because it's actually not in the core of the Lightning Network itself, if this thing blows up and fails, everything else is unaffected. It just continues as normal, basically. So you kind of have like a firewall here. It's like, okay, this is kind of like pure Bitcoin, pure Lightning. This is like other stuff, basically. And so because like the actual core of the network, for example, like there's not necessarily going to be a new bolt or something that covers this stuff. There's not necessarily going to be kind of like a bunch of modifications to actually the core specification itself. This is all things on the end that are all opt-in, right? So if this thing works, cool. Hey, you guys get more routing fees. If it doesn't, hey, well, cool. Hopefully someone has something else to give me more routing fees, right? So.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I think that that's a very good design that you guys did with that. Of that, you can either participate or not participate, and then if you just wanna, if you're just routing payments, you just keep routing payments, and it's all the same. So I applaud you for that design mechanism, because I think it's very, very good. And so when we think about sort of adoption in this, where do you guys see, either geographically or industry specific, of like, how do you see adoption of this like playing out? Is it like third world countries? Like, what do you guys are thinking there or seeing?
Yeah, I mean, like, definitely think have heard and we have people banging down our doors to give stable coins in emerging markets in the countries I mentioned earlier, right? So El Salvador, Brazil, Argentina, West Africa, Nigeria, Southeast Asia, Philippines, etc. And I think that's like the kind of low-hanging fruit. And again, just as this is building on kind of Jack Mahler's big announcement, what really opened people's eyes to is like, oh man, like, Western Union was founded in 1850 to productize the telegraph, right? And like they're still taking rents on remittances. Like we have the technology to fix this now, and having dollars on it makes it really approachable. So like that makes like is a clear and like very obvious demand. But I think again, like the other part that's kind of underrated right now is finally, after a bunch of years of work, like we have some major exchanges on the Lightning Network right now, right? We got some infrastructure and some traders that are like starting to like see some arbitrage opportunities and like new ways to make money. And I think giving them the experience of stablecoins, I think there's going to be a lot of adoption from that sector of the market, who are like have always been just kind of waiting for like the business opportunity to like jump on board and get all in on Lightning, and so I think there's going to be a lot of adoption from that sector as well.
Yeah, and I think one other thing, like in the past, like we always looked at kind of like like what's the cost, what's the friction like? For example, like even for things like remittances or people like sending back and forth, there's typically a bunch of like different hops, and each hop has like additional fee. Okay, it's kind of like the the credit card, the bank, like someone likes doing kind of like the remittance and the transfer, things like that as well too. If you add that back and up, it's it's not really feasible to hop back and forth that frequently. Maybe you're paying 1% something like that each time. So I think one thing that Taro does, it basically kind of like compresses that stack down, right? So all of a sudden now, like let's say they got that stablecoin over else, okay, all of a sudden they can swap to Bitcoin, right? Probably a lot more cheaply than they would any other way. So it's kind of a thing where it's like the world isn't necessarily going to go straight there. Some people did, and they're enthusiasts, and like they're really maybe even visionaries at that point as well too. But this gives people kind of like a incremental way. It's like, oh, I got the paycheck, maybe I'll do 20% now. Oh, maybe I'll do 30% now. Oh, this bank stuff, that sounds weird. What's going on in Europe? Maybe I'll do 40% now, right? So this kind of a thing where people can gradually get into the stage of things. So now maybe it's less of like we basically, you can say we're making the ramp like less steep, right? It's we're trying to make it a little bit easier for people to get on and off basically, and ideally they're going to be on more than off. And obviously there's a lot of stuff going on in the world right now, generally. So maybe people are going to be wanting to hold Bitcoin sooner than later. So.
Yeah, and I think with everything that's going on around the world, especially in like the bond markets and currency markets and stuff, right? The U.S. dollar is the least worst fiat currency, right? And so we just know that there is like strong demand to get into the dollar, in emerging markets, and I think we all believe that actually it's the last hop is going to be from the dollar into Bitcoin. And so wouldn't it be better, all these people fleeing into dollars, if they were fleeing into dollars in a wallet that allowed them to swap into Bitcoin instantly and basically for free, right? If Bitcoin is just right there, it's a button push away, I think that's just far better for the world than forcing them into some just yet another bank who will just force them to swap their dollars for the local fiat, which we've seen done from central banks all the time. So really excited about that, and I think we have the meme that we've been pushing that we're Bitcoinizing the dollar, right? And what that means to me is that we're rather than having Bitcoin compete with the dollar on the dollar's turf, right, in the fiat banking system, we're making the Bitcoin compete with the dollar on Bitcoin's turf, right? In our domain.
It's like that Bane meme. It's like you were raised in the darkness, like right?
Yeah, exactly.
You can come into my chain, like.
Awesome. Okay, well, that's really helpful, and I think that's where I see a lot of. I think in the emerging markets thing is really interesting to me. Of maybe like oppressed people as well, and having some mechanism of kind of ejecting from their systems as well. So I think that there's a lot of promise there too.
And like Alex Gladstein with HRF has done an amazing job highlighting those use cases, and I think for those of us that have been kind of following him and watching his work over the last couple of years, his tone kind of changed a little bit last year with all of this emerging markets adoption, where he was Bitcoin only and like Bitcoin needs to be the way, but just when faced with the reality of the market, it's like, look, these people just love stablecoins, right? Mm-hmm. And like, if we can give them stablecoins on Bitcoin infrastructure instead of stablecoins on these other crappy platforms, like that's just a huge win.
Yeah, I think another thing as well, like for a lot of these people, like you can say like their paycheck is already somewhat like a hot potato, right? The inflation in that country is very, very high, so they want to like basically pay all of their bills, everything very, very quickly as well too. Like, hey, what's a quick way to move in and out of Lightning and Bitcoin in general, or Bitcoin in general, which is like Lightning itself, right? So we can actually increase the velocity, basically, and their potential to basically get this thing in, send out a few different payments on the streams, then take this, save it, put in some other currency as well too. So we're giving them more, tools basically to defend themselves and their wealth as well. So
awesome. Cool. So the next question is like, when we think about stablecoins or just assets in general being issued on Taro, like how do we see that playing out? Is every pleb gonna have their beef coin, or is it gonna be like in like the Ethereum space? It's like a few select like issuers. Like how is that gonna play out?
Yet to be seen, right? Because, like, again, to be very clear, right, this is an open protocol. It's open specs, right? Like, we've built the first implementation. We expect there to be more. So, asset issuance is permissionless. You certainly can, if you want, make Gramcoin and try and force all the Voltage employees to accept it for their paychecks. I don't know if they'd be very happy with that.
Yeah, that wouldn't work out.
Sorry to be giving him ideas, guys. But I do think in the long run, we will see a lot of the same players issue, but I really hope, additionally, and we're working on getting some new players interested, right? Because I think the unique design of having these Taro assets plug in at the edge of the Lightning Network actually makes it to where it levels the playing ground a bit for like network effects of asset, where like the asset that has the network effect in the Lightning Network is Bitcoin, right? Because it's in the middle, and you need Bitcoin for every transaction. But if you could plug in, a Swiss franc stablecoin, just in one little subnetwork, one little subsection of the network, and your users can, receive in Swiss franc stablecoin denominated value and then can send out, but you're just plugging into the broader Bitcoin network. I think that really privileges kind of makes smaller asset issuers more of a first-class citizen in comparison to where they would be in, the DeFi space, where it's the network effect accrues to the asset itself. So, I really hope that we see longer tail asset issuers emerge, in addition to the existing centralized, existing players today who have tons of, USD, et cetera, issued already.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing I want to add to that as well is that, as far as the way we're looking at the architecture right now, like we're saying, things only exist at the edges, right? If people are familiar with Lightning, there's something called like a hop hint, right? It's kind of like, okay, well, typically these are like, unadvertised channel, it's a mobile phone or whatever else. But the cool thing about this, like in his example, like, let's say like I'm getting invoiced, right? At the end of the day, I know basically like, it's kind of like what they want to receive, basically what I need to send out for them to receive that, right? And the difference is that is basically a fee, right? And even on Lightning today, there's a bunch of different fees, no one has like the exact same fee rate as well too. So the cool part about this, I can like send out BTC. I don't even know what they're receiving at the end. He's like, hey, you're going to accept this thing. Okay, cool, whatever else, right? So that kind of like has, really some cool aspect as well, because now there's kind of like, some sort of like positive deniability where you can say abstraction over that last mile and that last hop. I don't really care what you're receiving, but you're saying if I send this in and then boom that, I get a pre-image and I can use this pre-image to like, complete my API key with for an LSAT or something else like that as well too. I think it's a really cool thing now, because now you basically abstract over all this other stuff. And even in the case, okay, well, I just think in Bitcoin now, rather than like all of these 25 different pairs, okay, well, I don't know what your rate is. I know I can send one BTC and you get 1.1 or 0.9, whatever else, and I'll do that. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when we think about, with hundreds of $billions of stablecoins on other networks and things like that coming to Lightning, like what are the things that we need to improve on in the Lightning Network? And then what are things like, the learnings that we've done so far that are like kind of help us to make this really, really well suited for that as well? So I'm kind of like trying to think, okay, that's substantially more volume than we have today. And like, what are the things we need to improve on? Like, how is that going to work out?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you can say like, number one, like if we have like a lot more kind of like, demand for payments, pathfinding needs to get better. We need to basically be more effective around kind of like, navigating the network itself, because maybe there's going to be more payments flowing back and forth than ever, right? And maybe like, a pro versus a payment, well, you can't really distinguish it because there's just so much more, volume. Another thing obviously is also, liquidity management as well, both for the internal node and also the nodes at the edges, because now if you're getting a lot more and more volume, basically, now you have like more intent to basically to optimize, and also maybe like, you have like a better, grasp of the opportunity cost if you're not able to like, collect all those payments, but also now at the edge, now maybe you have like, a few different assets, like 2 or 3. You also need to be able to like, obtain liquidity for those. And these we have like the swap markets. We have people that, buying and selling accounts as well too. So all of that stuff you can say, will, start to like get better and basically get more mature, because now you have the pressure of the user, right? I think it's kind of the thing where it's like, it's an interesting feeling, kind of like, startup, product type stuff where like, when you have people banging down your door and people asking for this stuff and you have that feedback, that's the best feeling, right? Because you're getting the feedback, you're iterating, you're doing things faster. But when you're kind of like just sit there and okay, well, are people using the thing? Are we working on the right thing? Did we make the right thing? Are we working on the, do our engineers working on the right thing? It's kind of like, difficult, but ideally we can give them that like more direct signal basically to get that flywheel going, get people, kind of innovating and being more excited about, things to move forward. But I think there's a few areas that, one other thing I was thinking of is probably accounting, right? Okay, yeah, right? Like, so it's one thing where, in the beginning we didn't really have that many tools, and like us businesses and other businesses as well. They're okay, well, I need to know how much I spent on chain fees. I need to know how much I spent on rebalancing. I need to know how much I made. Now, once you throw another potential asset in there, it's okay, well, we need to reconcile those. Like exactly, what are we doing for like marketing and things like that. So I can see kind of like accounting being another big thing, particularly for like, the big players who are, already doing all this stuff and getting their book checked and things like that. We'll definitely need a lot better tooling on that direction.
Yeah, I'm trying to come up with stuff that's like not the really boring answers, but I think the really boring answers are the best ones for this. It's like, better scalability on the database side, right? Like better security with your keys and, better cold store, cool storage options, right? Remote signer type stuff, accounting for sure. Now introducing, new assets, you're going to need to account for all that stuff. So better tooling there. All of that stuff is going to be really important and really in demand, as the Lightning Network continues to grow and professionalize, right? Like there's like, we hit 5,000 Bitcoin on the network in public network capacity the other day, right? Like there's like real money at stake and people that are, real businesses that are doing like really large volume now, right? Like we keep getting, stats from the big wallets who are publishing, hey, oh yeah, we did like, we just hit our 5 millionth transaction or something like that. It keeps getting like, there's real money at play here and it's only going to get bigger. So it's, continuing to professionalize the operations and make sure that the developers and businesses have what they need. Other boring stuff like making sure there's redundancy in your nodes, making sure you have high availability and failover and all that type of stuff that I think is going to be required for this stuff to really scale.
Yeah, and I think one last thing is like UIs, right?
Yeah.
This is a whole new thing. Initially for Lightning, like, okay, well, I have like my on-chain, I have the off-chain, I have the time lock, things like that as well too. I think we definitely need to see a lot of like kind of like creative, kind of like endeavors on the UI side, and then like Bitcoin design, people working on these things as well. So I think it's kind of like a new, kind of like paradigm. I think the big thing for this, and that's why we're so excited about, is like we feel like we're creating, you can say like more free energy, right? That entrepreneurs and kind of like very savvy individuals and developers basically take and harness, make cool stuff, maybe make a business on the side, maybe have more investment opportunities as well too. So ideally, it's basically just like grows everything, right? Like it's not going to be a very direct path, like a linear type of thing. Maybe like some things will go down, there'll be bugs, blah blah blah. But I think that's a really cool thing as far as like all these different opportunities. The UI I think will be really interesting because like you can picture some like swap centric UI, like there's like a slider or you click the button and it flips. I don't know, but y'all are gonna figure it out, right? So.
Yeah, that's right. No, awesome. And I think that like it's been really good. I feel like in the last like year, the Lightning Network, and as far as tooling goes, has been really progressing towards this level of adoption. So maybe not everything is solved yet, but like I think we're definitely all like pushing forward to achieve that. So that's really good. So we have just like 2 more minutes before I'll open it up to the group for more questions. But one thing that I wanted that we were talking about before we came out here is the difference between RGB and Taro. And I think that it's an important one that, like, frankly, I think a lot of us are just genuinely curious. And I think, I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to help people understand what that is.
Super good question. I'm also would like to learn a lot more with this myself, but you can say, okay, like, let's say you say, I want to express, assets on Bitcoin, right? There's kind of like a few different, questions you ask along the way. One is like, okay, where are we storing all the data on chain? You can say, okay, no, so you can picture like kind of like a decision tree. Okay, you go on this no side, right? And I think one other thing is like, okay, well, if we're not storing that, okay, we need to commit to some representation in an output, right? And in my mind, like that's kind of like where the commonality stops, right? And I think and I think one thing that we were trying to do with Taro is basically make it super simple, or simple as possible rather, and also make sure we have like a clear spec as far as like what's going on, right? So I think a lot of people like they've seen documentation, they've seen the spec, whatever else, they at least kind of like grasp in their head like what the main principles are, right? So I think from there on, like to me, as far as I've looked at it, there's very little commonality there. So maybe there's kind of like a shared paradigm basically of kind of like embedding an asset commitment or something like that in the output itself. But if you look at the way, how do we do transfers, addresses, asset IDs, the tree structure, auditing, the software itself, the spec, all of these are very, very different as well. So in my mind, it's kind of a thing where, maybe people can use both of them as well too. But I think at the end of the day, people kind of like protocols, you can say, also need a fit, right? And you basically need to be talking to, users and customers, things like that, to basically make sure you're kind of like, fitting that particular thing. I think we're focused on just kind of like, regular assets, things like that. I think they have a lot, larger ambition. There's like a P2P network, there's distributed file storage, there's a VM, there's like smart contracts, a bunch of other stuff as well too. And, I wish them luck and, and let them, move along with that. But I think we're focused on these particular things, and we're kind of like, being very focused as far as like what we're doing. And generally, we're positive at Lightning Labs, right? We assume positive intent basically, and we're going to do a thing, they can do a thing, maybe it comes together at the end, maybe it's a little bit too early. We want to see even like how this stuff actually develops in the first place basically. I think we're just kind of like going towards a market, and like, because we have this very, very strong demand, and we kind of like try to describe the protocol or for the slimmest particular thing for that particular instance of itself. So, anyone that says, oh, it's like a copy or whatever else, like, I mean, if you can show me, exactly like what thing is there, and I think, it's kind of like people have said that in the past, but they haven't really found any specific thing, right? It's kind of like, oh, are people like copying, is Join Market a copy of like Wasabi or something like that? Well, they're join, right? But things are very, very different as far as like how things work underneath and basically the protocol and things like that as well too. So do they occupy a similar paradigm? Sure. But at the end of the day, like this is all free open source, software. These are the protocols, right? Anyone can use this stuff right now as well too. So it's not as if like, we're somehow on this other different dynamic. It's kind of the thing as well where, stuff needs to kind of like, compete as well in the market. So we'll see kind of like, what comes of that.
Yeah, and I think that the common ancestor in the design, right, is like old school Bitcoin stuff. Peter Todd's single-use seals from 2015, something like that, right? Pay to contract hashed, all that sort of stuff. So there's like common ancestors, kind of research-wise. But I was excited. I was excited about RGB for a long time. I presented at the Lightning Conference in 2019 and shouted out RGB as like a project that I was excited about, and it was specifically for the use case of stablecoins on Lightning, right? I was in the Telegram group. I joined the community calls. Like I was, excited about what they're doing, and I think they kind of expanded the scope into the decentralized storage, into the kind of smart contracts, into a much broader VM, and kind of like the application that I wanted to enable was stablecoins on Lightning, right? And I think they kind of like, grew their scope into focusing on other things. And so, our Taro scope right now is like very focused on enabling the application of stablecoins on Lightning. And I think it's really, uniquely and well suited for enabling that specific application, like we talked about at the top of the conversation. Again, common ancestors, we have our really specific focus. They're trying to enable a more generalized thing, and wish them the best.
Sweet.
The last thing I was gonna say, like, in startup land, like it pays sometimes to just like ship stuff early. Ship, get some feedback. Like, for example, we released an alpha. Is everything completely 100% there? No, there's things that we know aren't really there, but we're able to get that feedback so we can iterate forward, make sure we're actually pushing things forward as well. And in any sort of like endeavor, there is the kind of technical side, but there's also kind of like the product and the business side and kind of like how that fits together. Basically, if everything's aligned up perfectly, okay, you can say we have an engine, we have a feedback loop, we're pushing that stuff forward. I think that's what we're trying to focus on as well. And I see we have 0 minutes in the back, so.
I was going to say, I think we kind of ran out of time for questions, but I'm sure that all three of us will hang out for a little while after. So if you have questions, like, certainly come up and ask. And yeah, thank you for joining us, and have a good tab.